Currently a research scientist at Intel Labs IP Design and Platforms Group. His research is largely focused on circuits and systems architecture for machine learning in emerging communications and computer systems. Dr. Dorrance has authored more than a dozen of IEEE conference and journal articles and holds several patents as well. He's also a co-recipient of the Best Industry Paper Award at RFIC 2019, Boston, Massachusetts. He is currently serving as a chair for the Oregon chapter of the IEEE Solid State Circuit Society and an associate editor for the IEEE Transactions on Circuits and Systems for Video Technology. A very warm welcome to you, sir. And now I'd like to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me get these slides shared up in there. Okay. Yeah, so you can all see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to be invited here to give you this talk about sort of developing your research acumen. So as sort of stated before, I'm a researcher in Intel Labs here in Hillsboro, Oregon, and I'm going to apologize. This talk is a little different from normally what I think of in terms of giving a very good talk, which has very little text and a lot of pictures and other things, and it tends to be self-explanatory. It's going to be a lot of text because it's about research, and sometimes research can just be a little dry like that. But I'm going to see if I can make this just a little bit more interesting in there for all of you. So sort of really first, what is research? What is R&D? And just simply, it's the purposeful, systematic generation of new knowledge, often to develop new products, processes, and services. So it's kind of a lot to take in there, but you can really kind of split it up into really 3 different types. So it's just sort of basic research, applied research, and development. And so basic research, sometimes just called blue sky research, is really just, as it's sort of, put here, about sort of discovering or improving fundamental knowledge. But it itself doesn't necessarily lead to sort of, products or anything in there that you might think of when you're thinking about research. Applied research, on the other hand, is sort of a lot more sort of substantial engineering work that has to go within there, and this is really what sort of leads to new products and electronics and other things that you're probably much more common and familiar with. And then sort of development is kind of taking those research aspects, research topics, and sort of taking those products and processes and transforming them into something that is consumable by sort of in terms of mass production for sort of regular people. And we'll get to it towards more the end of the talk, but you can kind of think that more basic research tends to kind of apply more towards academic type research, and applied research is generally what you think of maybe more in terms of industrial research in there. But there's a lot of synergy and coexistence between the two, and both are kind of really done both in academic and sort of industrial settings in there. But sort of before we actually sort of talk about like research and how you can sort of be a better researcher and do better research, I'm going to first talk about SMART goals, because those end up sort of being very important for doing very effective research. And so a SMART goal, if you've never heard of it before in terms of an acronym, stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And these are really 5 things in here that a good goal really needs to have. And if you want to do good research, you need to have sort of good goals. So for a goal to be effective, it needs to be specific. And if you would like to, be able to track the progress, know how you're doing, and other things, that goal needs to be measurable within there. Goals also need to be achievable. If they're not, realistic and reasonable, if you just, put too high of a bar up there in terms of how to do something, you're going to be discouraged. It's not going to be helpful, and you're not going to be able to make much of any progress. Goals also need to be relevant. You need to place a goal that's going to get you towards a target you're trying to get to in actual research. So it needs to be relevant to the large, overall big picture that you're trying to work on. And probably the most important thing when it comes there is it needs to be time bound. You need to know when that goal starts, when it finishes, and sort of all the different sort of steps and other things in between there, just to make sure that you can keep things moving and going on track. Because a very large problem that happens in both academic and industrial research is if there isn't a defined start and end to a project, or at least some sort of a time thing in there. You have projects and other things that just sort of seem to keep going on and on and on, sort of forever. Let's see. So there was a question that popped up there. Let me see if I can find a better way to show activate. Expand portal, other things. Let's see, how do I see the questions?
So probably we can take all the questions at the end.
Okay.
That would be fine, right? Otherwise, it would be hard for you to switch between your presentation and questions.
Yeah, it's just not letting me see them here while I'm presenting, but I did see a question pop up, and I will get to it there at the end. But yeah, so a very common problem in terms of research is you have a research topic and you sort of continue going on and going on and going on it, and it becomes just sort of a perpetual project that sort of lives in the lab. And if you're going to do some real innovation, you need to be able to end projects, clear them out, and start new ones within there. The next thing in there in terms of being able to sort of track a project, its success and other things, is how measurable it is. So the M from a SMART goal, and one of the very common ways to do that, that's very often talked about is a key performance indicator. And what that really is just some way to provide some objective evidence of progress towards achieving a desired result. And so this can take on a lot of different things in different engineering process, different scientific things. In machine learning chips, they always talk about TOPS per watt as your key performance indicator of how well it's been designed. In there, you can find all sorts of different metrics and things like that if you're talking about power converters, DACs, ADCs in terms of femtojoule per conversion step, and all of that in there. And so really what the purpose of a key performance indicator is to measure what is intended to be measured. And it's key that it's what you're intending to measure. That way you can make informed decisions about directions for the research, the success of the research, and if you're going to take that engineering work into an actual product. And so, yeah, so in research, KPIs are usually sort of set in there for trying to place the desired outcome for some different targets and other things. And these key performance indicators can really need to be sort of a mixture of two different types, leading indicators and lagging indicators. And so leading, as it says, is just trying to sort of predict the future, some future outcomes. So while you're doing research, you would have these leading key performance indicators in there to try and gauge how well something is going to be once it's completed. And the lagging, it's sort of a measure of past performance, past success to be able to score yourself afterwards. And a very key thing in terms of how you choose these key performance indicators is you want to make sure they're appropriately chosen so that you don't try and game the system or reward bad behavior in there when it comes to how you would do the research, how you would try and direct things and stuff in there. So these key performance indicators and these SMART goals will be very important in there while actually trying while something is going to complete it. Let's see, I'm getting some audio feedback. Okay, there we go. Yeah. So what is the research process that we go in there? So it's really these sort of 5 steps in here. You can split it up into sort of a learning phase, a defining stage, the ideation phase, exploration, and evaluation. And we'll step through each of these within there to talk about specifics for each steps within this process. So the first one, learning, is really just sort of about information discovery, kind of building a foundation for the research problem that you're going to be trying to tackle and look after. The next step within there is sort of defining exactly what the problem is. And so it's very important to establish a very clear problem statement, because that's going to direct what research you're going to be doing and how you're going to try and solve that particular problem. Probably one of the most important steps in there is the ideation phase. It's then coming up with a whole host of ideas in terms of how to try and tackle and solve that problem statement within there. And then after you have this whole collection of ideas, you go through the step that maybe is more of what people think of as research, where you're simulating, you're prototyping, you're testing out those ideas. And then after that, you go through sort of an evaluation phase where you kind of analyze and benchmark the simulations, prototypes, and tests. These, even though I've kind of laid this out here in sort of a linear process, it's not necessarily an actual linear process. You can, some of these things kind of happen simultaneously. Sometimes they happen a little out of order. There's a lot of iteration and other things that happen throughout there within this process. And so kind of stepping through this within the first process, just learning, building that foundation for knowledge. You really want to start broad. If you're talking about you're going to jump into a new topic. So for example, say you want to, start tackling a problem about data converters or something because you're very interested in it, but you maybe don't have that good of a background. In that case, Google, Wikipedia, IEEE Explorer, they are your friends in terms of being able to try and search, find foundational papers about there, and reading and trying to kind of understand that topic that you're trying to dive into for research. And sort of a tip in there in terms of being able to build that is, if you found an interesting paper that sort of caught your eye, and you're trying to learn more about it, is you look up, kind of, at the end of the paper an index, and you find its references, and you find, what it's citing as, its source for talking about, an issue, a problem, or some work that they're improving upon. And then you read that paper and you look at its references and you read that paper until you kind of get to the original first kind of paper or something in there. That's, you know, at least usually my preferred method in terms of trying to dive into a new subject area, or if there's just a new problem or something that we're kind of going through and facing. And while you're sort of you know, going through and trying to kind of build this foundation of knowledge, it's also important to understand that time management is very important within that. So it's very important that you set aside some dedicated time, if that's daily, weekly, within there, to just try and sort of, you know, consume and absorb information. And so I say information because it doesn't need to be technical papers from you know, the IEEE or some other journal in there. It can, you know, honestly be, you know, YouTube videos, textbooks, attending lectures, other things. Just some way to sort of increase that knowledge base within there. If you have the opportunity, I would highly suggest that you know, be able to attend conferences and listen to papers and presentations in person. It provides a, you know, great opportunity to actually meet and network with other individuals, be able to ask them, you know, questions and you know, really get into what is kind of, you know, the sort of forefront of problems within a certain area. And then in, you know, kind of sort of the next step in there is that it's also very important to kind of verify and replicate information from sort of a variety of sources. Because just because a single paper, somebody says that this is, you know, an important problem or this is the way you kind of solve it, it's not necessarily true within there. And it's, you know, very often when you're starting in a new area, it's important to, as a former manager of mine said, get your hands dirty. Go out, you know, do a tutorial, try and implement something, try and actually, you know, build a circuit, run a, you know, a machine learning simulation or something in there, just so you can see kind of how it works, what the problems are, you know, what it actually takes to solve a problem like that. And then sort of, you know, finally within there with all of this information, it's very important to stay organized, take some notes, and be able to sort of collate that information in a manner that is, you know, organized to you, so that, you know, you can go back to it, you can review it, and you can figure that out in there. Now, once you've gone through and you've you know, learned all this great stuff, you need to now clearly define what the problem is that you're trying to tackle in terms of research. And so what it means to sort of clearly define that problem is you need to be able to say what gap exists, what is that problem, and then once you've been able to, you know, do that, you need to be able to say, you know, not only why is it a problem, but what is its impact. You need to be able to quantify it. So having some sort of measurable, you know, KPI in there, something like that in there is very important, because you know, also need to, as the third bullet point here says, be able to establish that there is some importance or urgency to that problem. That doesn't matter if you're in an academic environment, and it's very important in an industrial environment, because if you can't explain why it is an important or urgent problem that needs to be solved, you're not going to get manager approval. You're not going to get money or funding to go do that research or implement it. If you're in an academic setting, you would need to write grants and other things in there. And if it's not an important problem, or it doesn't necessarily need to be urgent, but if it's not an important problem, nobody's got money to give you for a grant to do research on it. Now, when you define this problem, it's very important that you need to, you know, you'd like to keep it broad, but you also want to be able to leave it manageable. Because if you sort of define the problem as, you know, too broad, it's going to be kind of all-consuming, and you're going to, struggle to find sort of a clear direction to be able to actually tackle that problem. But if you, define that problem sort of too small within there, you're going to struggle with, actually finding any sort of room for innovation or actual creative freedom in how you try and solve that problem. And then, perhaps the sort of most important thing about a problem is you need to be able to ask questions, because you're never going to, solve the problem unless you ask the right question. And that kind of really means, that you might have to ask a lot of the wrong questions in there before you actually land on what the right question is to get to the right problem. I know, at least where I work, I have a reputation in forums and meetings and other things of asking a hell of a lot of questions within there, but very often, just the process of, say, asking questions. Okay, so it's a problem, so why is it a problem? Why is it important? What about this, that, other things can really help shape defining what the problem is within there. Okay, so now you've defined the problem. You have a very clear problem statement. Now you get to what is called sort of the ideation phase. And ideation is really just the process of generating a broad set of ideas on a given topic. But the most important part of this process is there is no attempt to judge or evaluate the ideas at that given time. So you just want to, kind of throw out ideas and just, as it says here, don't focus on what's, technically viable, financially viable. You can ignore resource constraints and any things. You want to generate sort of as many different ideas as possible, and you don't want to get hung up on, if it's plausible, if it, whether or not it violates physics within there, because very often, just being able to come up with these different ideas, and if you get stuck on like, well, we might not be able to get funding and stuff to do that, it may turn out that really it's the best idea. And so now your new problem is instead, convincing your manager, your manager's manager, or if you're a graduate student, your PhD advisor or something in there, that this is the problem and they need to give you money or something to solve it within there. So if you sort of bring these different constraints and other things too early into the problem, you can actually kill a solution before you get a chance to actually go through and evaluate it and see, is it actually a good solution? That being, and then again, I guess kind of following that, this is probably one of the few cases where quantity is preferred over quality, because you're going to judge if an idea is a good idea later on. So don't get hung up as to whether or not it's a good or a bad idea at this point within there. And at least in this phase, it's a really good idea to just bounce ideas off a variety of people. If you've ever been a part of a good brainstorming session in any kind of environment, there's usually multiple individuals there, and you can just sort of start bouncing ideas off of each other or talking about something, and that might shake something loose in somebody's thinking, and will generate more ideas, because being able to use other people as kind of a sounding board can really provide some crucial insights in alternative perspectives in that phase there. So now you've gotten a whole bucket full of ideas. You need to test and prototype them. And so sort of in this exploration phase is where you need to sort of build a model, a prototype, something that will allow you to start testing ideas. And sort of the key here in this phase is ideally you want it to be as minimal and inexpensive as possible. And inexpensive in terms of your time, the resources you need to apply to do that, just kind of everything in general. With the idea being that if you're going to fail, you want to fail fast. You don't want to waste a lot of time testing out ideas, testing a theory, and having it fail. You'd like to know, is this idea a good idea or a bad idea? And so you'd like a model, a prototype, some sort of a test that will help you determine that as quickly as possible. And very often when you fail, it's not a bad thing. It's going to give you a lot of valuable information and insight into the problem. Because if you just try something and it works, you haven't really, for the most part, gained any valuable insight as to why it worked, or how this is necessarily solving your problem when you get lucky within there. And while you do this, you can sort of refine your model as you go. So very often when you want to kind of go through and test these ideas and do this prototyping, you build the simplest model you possibly can to start with. And you can go through and test a bunch of ideas, and a bunch of them will fail. And you'll still have some left over, and you need to be able to judge them again. So you make your model a little bit more complex. You add in some more non-idealities or other things within there, and you can sort of rerun your ideas that kind of got through the first stage again. And you can iterate that way until you end up having sort of a much more complicated model for your ideas within there, with the idea being that every time you go through one of these iterations or steps, you're adding in more bits of that problem that you're trying to solve with your research. And if by the time you've built a complex model that is essentially exactly the problem you're trying to solve, and you have a solution there, then you've kind of completed and finished your research in there. But kind of with this testing and iteration process that you go through there, there's a step here after you've kind of done this testing and prototyping, to go back and look and sort of reframe and refine the problem that you're looking at. And this is again where you need to ask yourself some questions, kind of sort of what worked, what didn't work. Is there anything I kind of need to do different within there? Maybe none of the ideas work, so you have to go back and think like, okay, do I need to change what my problem statement is that I'm trying to solve? Is that problem too ambitious? Maybe it's too narrow. You kind of need to reincorporate all those learnings that you've had within there. And then depending upon sort of how much time has happened in there, and this is maybe less relevant for academic research, and maybe a little bit more relevant for industrial business applications, where there's usually some sort of time urgency to solving a problem because of a product that's going out, or a customer request or something in there, is just asking yourself, is this still a relevant problem? Maybe with you going through this whole process and doing that there, maybe some other academic already solved that problem, so there's no work left to do it. Or your company's restructured and they've no longer in that line of business anymore, so it doesn't matter if you end up solving that problem. It's not going to make any impact on the company's bottom line, so it's not worth continuing to pursue. And very often when you get into sort of this testing and prototyping phase within there, It can sort of spark new ideas, new research directions. You know, I've had this before where we're working on one project trying to solve a particular problem, and we test and prototype something out, and it, you know, solves the problem or doesn't solve the problem, or it gets stuck. But in the process of building that prototype, that model, that chip, we get sort of, you know, new ideas or a new problem that's maybe adjacent that's like, oh, okay, it can solve this, it can do that. And just sort of, you know, the research sort of veers off in a different direction within there. Now, so kind of we've talked about this, but once you've you know, done this prototyping, you've done this testing, you've got your KPIs that you're in there and you're measuring, you need to go through a sort of final step of kind of evaluating that research and the performance within there, being able to sort of benchmark it within there. And there are a few, you know, very important steps within there. And so, you know, one of probably the most important things about this, you know, benchmarking phase in there is it needs to be transparent. And so by transparent, that means it needs to be based upon some rational predefined metrics. So sort of at the start, when you've defined the problem, there needs to be some targets, some goals within there to be able to judge whether or not it is a successful solution or not. It's also within sort of a management chain in there, whether say you're a graduate student and you're talking to your professor, you need to be able to say like, this is you know, the metrics we were targeting, this is what we defined sort of before, and this is where we're landing. Or if you're, you know, manager of a whole division for you know, some product line, before, you know, sending people off to go and do this work, do this research and other things, you need to have a, you know, rational, explainable set of metrics that they need to design towards. And you know, once you've done this evaluation, it needs to be communicated in a timely fashion to all the stakeholders. And so those stakeholders will again depend upon the project you're working on, your, you know, if it's, you know, a company, if it's academic, other things, if it's, you know, work with the government on some sort of a research thing. But once you have those results, you need to again deliver them in a timely fashion. So if you know, basically came up with the cure for cancer and you just twiddled your thumbs and sat on it there for 20 years, that's not, you know, very timely. Within there. And sort of finally, the sort of, you know, evaluation within there needs to be organized, needs to be aligned with your organization's strategic priorities. So if you're, for my example, me within Intel, these, you know, evaluations need to be judged upon metrics that Intel as a business cares about. Which is basically, you know, how is this going to sell us, help us sell more Xeon processors within there, as opposed to say, in an academic environment where you know, it might be like, how does this, you know, help the electrical engineering department, or how does this help, you know, my professor get tenure or something within there. Sort of the difference between strategic, you know, priorities if you're talking about academic versus a business in there. And so the benefits of making sure that this evaluation is transparent is it, you know, improves communication between sort of all the different parties involved within there. So if you're working on a piece of a larger puzzle, research puzzle within there, if you sort of, you know, communicate your results in a timely fashion that allows other people to do, you know, their jobs, you know, and kind of get things up the chain and up to the product within there. You know, increases engagement between people, when you're delivering that all of that, and it leads to sort of a sense of fairness and accountability within the research. So if you don't have rational metrics for judging something, or things are predefined, you're going to have a pretty poor culture within sort of your research lab about how things are judged. It's going to seem very arbitrary, and it's going to just make it a very difficult work environment. And all of these together within there, it's going to allow you to end up with kind of much more relevant ideas that will end up sort of being implemented better when you do that. And so when you're in this phase, you need to make a decision, and you need to be decisive about it within there. And so once you've completed this assessment and sort of delivered it within there, again within sort of this learn, define, ideate, explore, evaluate phase, it provides sort of another kind of good place to sort of loop back and just kind of reassess sort of the solution space and the ideas that you had generated within there. And so again, this is a great time to sort of ask yourself sort of what worked, what didn't work. Do you need to adjust sort of the idea that you were working on? Did it maybe hit your sort of intended goals? Did it fall short a little bit? Did it deliver all the performance you need, but it's just too expensive? Yeah, just to be able to go back in there, and once you've sort of gone through all this process and you have all those learnings, it's also a great tool to help you sort of generate new ideas within there. As well as once you've done this, do you need to add new constraints? Are there new metrics? Has sort of the solution space you need to look at, has this changed? Very important questions to kind of ask yourself throughout the whole process. And then again, remember, it's an iterative process, and that applies to defining both the problem and the solution within there. Now, after kind of going through sort of this whole process, I did want to talk a little bit about sort of the difference between kind of industrial research and academic research, having been on both sides of that fence. For industrial research, it's often shorter term, and it really requires alignment with business needs. So while say at Intel Labs, I have a lot of freedom to work on a variety of different topics, ultimately it needs to align with Intel's bottom line. It needs to be research focused towards products and services that we would are currently offering or would eventually like to offer. So it means that's about silicon design, packaging, CPU architecture, graphics, data center, all of that software. But that means that if I wanted to, I couldn't go work on research for drug delivery or vaccines or other things, because it doesn't align at all with Intel. If I tried to do that, they'd probably fire me. Academic research, on the other hand, is a lot more long-term, a lot more open-ended, and it's a lot more flexible. You usually have sort of, for the most part, complete freedom to work on whatever you would like, with the caveat that you can get funding to do that research. But sort of these two modes of research, industrial and academic, are very synergistic. They work together quite well. In industry, we tend to follow academic research to monitor trends. We will often fund academic research quite a bit, do co-research with universities, all the time, within there. And in academics, will generally apply for grants and funding from industry, mostly because they like to work on real world problems. While they can work on kind of, anything and everything, most people prefer to work on a problem that they feel has some impact, and they can actually see what that impact is within there. And then so kind of, within here, just a few thoughts in terms of while doing this research, what does it mean to sort of deliver impactful research? And impactful research is really the ability to translate problems and solutions and connect it back to some business impact. And this applies to both industry and academic. For academic research, it's usually much harder to be able to have very impactful research, because a lot of it is just sort of general foundational knowledge building research, and it's usually decades out from being implemented into commercialized products that affect people's everyday lives. I know while I was a graduate student at UCLA, there was a Nobel Prize given for the invention of, I believe, the CCD camera. And so one of the professors there, Ideate, gave us all a talk about the importance of this, of sort of the CCD sensor that was invented with a colleague of his that he had worked with at in Bell Labs years and years and years before. But so that was the invention of the CCD sensor, and it took 30, 40 years before really the impact of that could be done and measured within there. So it can take a long time. But when you talk about sort of business impact, it becomes a question of marketing, which is not a thing that you usually think of at all about in engineering. Most engineers are not great at marketing within there. And so marketing requires really kind of three things in there: engagement, collaboration, and communication to be successful. And so you need to be able to engage with sort of customers or stakeholders or whoever is sort of affected by that problem. Be able to sort of collaborate them, iterate through the problem with them, being able to sort of figure out what is the best solution within there, and being able to sort of have sort of this free-flowing communication of information between yourself as the researcher, the stakeholders who it affects, and then ultimately being able to sort of sell that to a wider audience that maybe doesn't know it necessarily affects them within there. And so a key purpose in there, and one that a lot of researchers tend to struggle with, is being able to sort of clearly identify and work with stakeholders of that problem, to be able to sort of understand and clarify both their stated and unstated needs. And so trying to deliver sort of impactful research is sometimes like reading a crystal ball, and being able to try and predict the future by looking at different trends and other things that are going on within the industry, academia, and trying to figure out where are things going to be, and just sort of trying to get a little bit ahead of the curve within there. And the sort of final thing in terms of kind of, if you think about sort of marketing, that is once you've done that research and you have sort of I'd say a good solution, one of the hardest parts is being able to sort of curate well-crafted reports and presentations within there that provide sort of actionable insights, to allow for people to make informed decisions. So being able to write a good technical paper, being able to give a good presentation are key to being able to deliver impactful research. You know, if you have the best solution in the world, but you can't explain it, no one's gonna be able to buy it and sell it. And so I also think in terms of, you know, being able to do your research, if you can't explain, you know, maybe the problem and the solution in, you know, a couple of minutes to just sort of a layman, you maybe don't necessarily understand the problem or the solution as well as you should. So I guess maybe one way to think about that is you know, if a 5-year-old asked you, what is your research you're doing and what is the solution, that you could explain it to them and they would understand. That's you know, not necessarily true for every single research problem and things, but it should be, you know, true for most of them within there. And then just sort of, you know, some final thoughts upon, you know, being able to sort of, you know, build your research acumen and deliver impactful research is again, it's not a linear process. There's a lot of stops and starts and failures and you know, going back and then having, you know, in the shower or out on the run or something, just sort of one of those light bulb moments within there that, you know, just sort of lets you leap forward and do all that. And again, failure is an important part of the process. It's a very important part of the process, and so you shouldn't get too discouraged. I would say when, you know, you're kind of going through and you know, building things kind of within each sort of stage of an idea, is that 90% of the things don't pan out. So you have a research problem you want to work on, you come up with 100 ideas, 90 of them fail, and then you kind of go on to the next step, you know, step in terms of prototyping, doing other things, and you know, another 90% fail. And this happens and happens, and so you'll go through, you know, hundreds and hundreds of ideas or different tweaks or other things before something kind of is successful and works. And a lot of the times, a lot of that failure is kind of outside of your control. So, you know, another key thing to maybe think about within there is to only really worry about the items that are under your control. And then finally, you know, just read, share, and collaborate with other individuals. Research is rarely the work of a single individual. It's usually a you know, very dedicated team, or it's built, you know, slowly over the years, piecemeal with one little, you know, puzzle piece at a time until you can sort of complete the entire picture within there. Yeah, and so I think that is the end of my presentation, and I'd be very happy to answer some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I think I can now. Let's see. Yeah.
Okay, we can even ask the participants to unmute and ask the question, because I guess we do have time and we have just a couple of participants.
Yeah, we have time. It seems like there's a reasonable number of people online. Yeah, so maybe I'll go with this first question that's sort of typed in here. So what is the process of coming up with a good idea topic for research? What can be developed into a paper or patent? So it kind of, I guess it sort of depends upon kind of the context. Would this, let's see. So if I guess if you're thinking in maybe more like a academic setting, in terms of, you know, what could be sort of a good paper or patent, maybe it should be more of like what is you know, necessary in terms of, say, your graduation requirements, or what your sort of career goals within there are. If you need to, you know, have a topic for, say, your master's thesis or PhD thesis, honestly, talking with the professors in the department are a, you know, great resource in terms of finding ideas and working on that. More often than not, a professor has hundreds of ideas just sort of rattling around in their brain, and they're just looking for somebody to help them, think about it, implement it, and do that. If you're a postdoc, or you're in a company working on things, it's very often, maybe a good way to think about it is, what are the kind of day-to-day problems that your company faces with a particular product. So I'll just use, say, Intel as an example, where let's just say like Spectre or Meltdown in terms of like CPU security. It's like, oh well, we just got totally slammed in the stock market because of some security loophole or something like that. So that can be a good inspiration for looking into security architecture or other things and stuff in there. Being able to say what is a good patent idea is honestly, it's a question I leave to lawyers. We will do different patent harvesting sessions and other things, and that is where sort of when I talked about that ideation phase, where you just sort of forget about some of the different constraints, whether or not something's maybe totally practical or it makes a lot of financial sense. You just throw ideas at a patent lawyer until they say, no, that's too stupid, we're not going to do that. But anything kind of short of that, they'll tell you kind of what they think. If you're not in a large enough company that has that, then you maybe have to work a little bit harder to figure out what is the financial viability and some of the other things and stuff within there. Okay, let's see. Next question there. How would you compare theoretical and experimental aspects of research? Yeah, so that's a good question. So I guess I'll use maybe wireless as an example in there, because you can really talk about sort of like maybe the theoretical aspect of like the channel loss, or how you're going to set up a problem for some communications problem within there. And so there is sometimes a lot to be said for being able to derive sort of a closed formed theoretical solution, or a family of kind of solutions for a particular problem that is kind of good on paper. Those definitely have a number of applications, but sometimes it's a lot easier to say just simulate what an actual problem might happen. It's kind of the difference between physics and engineering. Physics is sort of very precise of what happens in there, and engineering is often a question of what's good enough within there. And so, and even within say machine learning is sort of a very hot topic and things and stuff within there, is that you have different types of machine learning in there. You have a field of machine learning just called probabilistic machine learning in there, where there's a lot of random sampling and other things and stuff in there, and you're not really trying to find closed form solutions where you might try and derive a theoretical bound for something, but you would just sort of experimentally figure out what that bound is. And those different aspects of research, it's I guess it kind of depends upon what you're working on. If you're working on a lot of, say, algorithms or software within there, they can tend to lead towards more theoretical. Whereas when you have a lot more sort of like ASIC chip design or other things within there, tends to be a bit more experimental. But it can also go the other way when you have, say, like circuit architecture or other things. There can be a lot of, theory in there about how you want to, say, build the architecture for a CPU. And for software, definitely when you're implementing like a operating system or something like that, it's a lot more experimental than it is theoretical. Let's see. Explain about ideas, but how to find an area of interest. So finding an area of interest is can be somewhat sort of a personal thing in there in terms of what you'd like to go and research. So there's a very good friend of mine from college who got his PhD from MIT and works on sort of speech recognition and machine learning and all the things within there. He really got into that line of research and topic within there because of a variety of health problems that sort of his mother had in terms of speech and other things and stuff in there. So it can be very personal and things like that in terms of finding an area of interest. Or it could also be what is just sort of the new hot topic that's coming up. I do know a lot of researchers that like to try and figure out what's going to be the next hot topic that's coming up because they want to work on the cutting edge all the time. And so 5-6 years ago, all those people would have been getting into machine learning and autonomous driving and other applications like that within there. And so it kind of that area of interest does sort of depend upon your goals, because if you want to say work on the most latest cutting edge thing, or you want to work in a field that's going to pay very well, those are going to sort of direct different areas of interest within there, as well as as I mentioned before, if you're a graduate student and you're trying to find a thesis topic within there, you have sort of very different motivations in terms of finding that area of interest. You want something that's going to be end up being a good master's thesis, but you want something that's going to have some reasonable success for getting completed. And I'll just short story in there is that while I was at UCLA, there was a friend of mine that was had worked for 6-7 months on a master's thesis with a professor, and it was just happened to be one of those cases where the idea it didn't pan out, it didn't work out, and other things. And so he went back to his advisor and asked him about it, and the advisor just kind of shrugged. It's like, well, you don't have to graduate within there. And so he very quickly found a new advisor and switched and got a new topic to work on in terms of doing that. So yeah. No, I think these have all been very good questions in there. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, if anyone else has any question, you can unmute and speak as well. Okay, I think there are no more questions. So before we move into the vote of thanks section, I would request everyone to turn on their cameras for a group picture. Oh, there's one more question.
What should first-time paper writers need to keep in mind? Yes. Okay. I have a lot of thoughts about writing papers, having being currently an associate editor and having reviewed for a number of journals and things in there, is that you need to be sort of very clear about what sort of your problem statement is, why it's relevant. You need to make sure to cite up-to-date relevant sources in there. But one of the things that in engineering that kind of very often gets looked over is your writing has to be it doesn't have to be like a Pulitzer Prize winning piece, but it needs to be well written with sort of correct spelling and grammar within there. The figures need to be appropriately sized. They need to have, readable, legible text within them. We have a big internal conference in Intel here that they do every year that we recently just went through, reviewing all of the papers in there. And so this is where, there'll be like 3,000-4,000 paper submissions from just any of the 120,000 people at Intel can submit a paper in there to go through there. But for a lot of people, it is the maybe the first time that they've tried to write a technical paper, or it's been 20 years since they were in college, since the last time they had to write a term paper. And so it can, even if it is the best idea in the world, if it is not if it does not have, some reasonably good grammar or spelling or structure in terms of how it's written, or if it jumps around other things, it can be very jarring to read, and it tends to throw off the reviewers in there, and it can be a hindrance for that idea to get in there. So my suggestion in terms of when you're writing that paper is to first figure out what your page limitation is. So say it's going to a conference and they have a 4-page limit. I would write 5-6 pages first, and then sort of edit and cut it down, because it's a lot easier to take a larger paper and sort of cut it down to the bone where you have the most important parts than it is to try and sort of take a smaller paper and make it bigger within there. And so once you've done that, I would just sort of sit on the paper and not do anything with it a week, kind of let it fall out of your head, and then come back and read it again. And that's usually the time when I figure out that I was a complete idiot in terms of how I was describing something, or maybe that doesn't make sense, or no, I need to add something else in there. And kind of after that process, having other people read it and give you feedback is also very important, especially if they are not necessarily a expert within your area. They can maybe point out things that are not clear to them, or that because you're so into that particular space that you don't realize you've used a bunch of acronyms that don't necessarily make sense, or you need to define what they are for other people to understand what your work is. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you, Richard, for answering all the questions. And yeah, now let's move on to the group photograph. Request all of you to turn on your cameras. And we'll just click a small picture and then move on to the vote of thanks and end the session post that. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I think that should be fine.
Okay.
Let me share my screen. So thanks a lot, Richard, for making time at this time of the day and delivering this insightful talk. So a small token of appreciation and memento from our side. I'll share my screen. Let me know once my screen is visible.
I can see it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for delivering this talk.
All right, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, and for all the participants, we do host monthly webinars from the IEEE Young Professionals Affinity Group. So Keep a watch out for those emails and try to participate in the upcoming webinars. Yeah. Thanks a lot for everyone for joining, and have a great day.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah.